Tonight, we are witnessing a military operation American defense planners feared for years, quietly war-gamed in classified rooms, and consistently hoped would never move beyond theory. Yet it did. What unfolded forced Vladimir Putin into an urgent midnight meeting with his highest military command, and what happened next fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of this war. This was not improvisation. This was not a symbolic strike. According to intelligence assessments, Ukraine executed an operation that had been modeled dozens of times but never expected to be carried out. It was methodical, devastatingly precise, and months in preparation. Operational security was so tight that even Allied intelligence agencies detected only fragments, not the full picture. For more than 18 months, Ukrainian military doctrine followed patterns that Moscow learned to anticipate. Defensive posture dominated. Strategic objectives remained within boundaries Russia believed it controlled. But 7 days ago, that predictability collapsed. Intelligence monitoring stations began registering anomalies that did not align with established Ukrainian behavior. Long-range assault units quietly repositioned near Odessa. Electronic warfare battalions moved forward. Elite special operations forces withdrew from Donbass without replacement. Secure communications went dark. Western analysts recognized these signals instantly. They had seen them before, but never at this scale. Coordination was tighter. Security was nearly impenetrable. Forces do not move this way unless absolute surprise is required. And from those movements, only one conclusion remained. Ukraine was preparing to strike something that would trigger a major international reaction. In the early morning hours, space-based infrared sensors detected multiple high-speed thermal signatures launched from Ukrainian-controlled areas. At least 7 weapon systems, dormant for over 2 years, were suddenly active. These were capabilities Ukraine had deliberately preserved for a moment when it wanted to deliver a message that could not be misinterpreted. That message was unmistakable. Ukraine had abandoned restraint. Red lines Moscow insisted were inviolable were crossed deliberately. Assets declared off-limits were struck. Pentagon analysts were momentarily uncertain which escalation category this operation belonged to, or whether it encompassed all of them at once. What they knew for certain was this: Ukraine had fundamentally altered its escalation posture. And when Ukraine changes escalation posture without warning, Washington notices immediately. The statement released by the White House tonight was not routine. It was not ceremonial. It carried urgency rarely displayed in public communications. Senior officials emerging from an emergency situation room meeting described the strikes as sovereign, precise, and irreversible. That final word matters. Irreversible means there is no diplomatic off-ramp, no face-saving exit, no pause to rewind decisions already made. Deterrence only works when hesitation follows. What came from Moscow instead was alarm. Within hours, Putin convened an emergency consultation with his top military leadership. Not for optics, not for show, but because the assumptions underpinning Russia's strategic posture had just been invalidated in front of the world. This was not a routine briefing. These are the meetings held when threats stop working. For nearly 2 years, Moscow believed it had learned Ukraine's playbook. Patterns were mapped. Responses were anticipated. Russian planners convinced themselves that Ukrainian operations would remain bounded, defensive, and ultimately manageable. That assumption created complacency. And complacency is fatal in modern warfare. What Russian intelligence failed to grasp was that the signals appearing 7 days ago were not noise, they were a deliberate silence. Ukrainian units did not communicate the way Moscow expected. Secure channels went dark not because of disruption, but because nothing was being said. When forces move without chatter, it signals preparation at the highest level. Long-range assault units repositioned near Odessa without the usual logistical buildup Russia's surveillance relies on. Electronic warfare battalions move forward early, not to support defense, but to blind sensors before an offensive. Elite special operations forces withdrew from Donbass without replacement, creating gaps that looked like weakness but were in fact redeployment. To analysts watching closely, this was not retreat. It was consolidation. Western intelligence picked up fragments, anomalies that did not quite fit established Ukrainian behavior. But even allied agencies underestimated the scale. Coordination was tighter than anything previously observed. Security protocols were nearly impenetrable. Forces only operate this way when absolute surprise is the objective and when the target carries strategic weight. By the time Russian monitoring systems began to register high-speed thermal signatures, the window for prevention was already gone. Space-based sensors detected launches from Ukrainian-controlled territory involving weapon systems that had not been operationally used in over 2 years. These capabilities were never abandoned. They were preserved for a moment when Ukraine needed to demonstrate not just resolve, but reach. Pentagon analysts later acknowledged that uncertainty followed the first detections, not about whether Ukraine struck, but about what category of escalation this represented: conventional, strategic, psychological. The reality was more unsettling. It was all of them at once. Ukraine was no longer signaling intent, it was executing it. And this is where Moscow's miscalculation becomes clear. Russian strategy depended on the belief that Ukrainian restraint was permanent, that Western caution would enforce limits even if Kyiv wanted to push further. That belief shaped defenses, dispersal schedules, and readiness. When Ukraine crossed thresholds Russia assumed were untouchable, those defenses proved insufficient. Within hours, the Kremlin understood something had gone wrong at a foundational level. The issue was not damage alone, it was exposure, the realization that assumptions Moscow relied on to control the pace and geography of this war no longer applied. And when assumptions collapse, responses become reactive rather than planned. That is why what followed was not immediate retaliation, but emergency consultation. When leaders call meetings in the middle of the night, it signals not confidence, but recalculation. What Ukraine struck was not random, and it was not symbolic. Intelligence agencies confirmed a coordinated deep penetration operation against multiple target categories inside Russian sovereign territory. But one location stood above the rest: Engels, a name that carries weight inside Moscow's strategic calculus. Engels is not just another airfield. It is the cornerstone of Russia's strategic aviation. It houses the bombers that deliver Moscow's most devastating conventional and nuclear cruise missiles. It is the physical embodiment of Russian deterrence, a facility reinforced precisely to prevent this exact scenario. And Ukraine hit it directly. The timing mattered. Ukrainian forces struck before Russia could disperse the Tu-95 and Tu-160 bombers stationed there. The primary runway was damaged, rendering it temporarily unusable for heavy bomber operations. Hardened aircraft, shelters, designed to withstand precisely this kind of attack, were compromised. Most critically, the ammunition storage facility was destroyed while preparations were underway to reload nuclear-capable cruise missiles. This was not coincidence. Analysts emphasize that the strike window reveals detailed intelligence about operational cycles at the base. Ukraine knew when munitions would be exposed. They knew when defensive measures were weakest. They exploited that window with precision that left Russian planners scrambling for explanations. By targeting the infrastructure that keeps Russia's strategic aviation operational, Ukraine delivered more than damage. It delivered doubt. The message was not about one base. It was about vulnerability. If angles could be reached, protected, and disrupted, then the assumptions underpinning Russian deterrence no longer held. This explains the urgency in Washington's response and the alarm in Moscow. Ukraine's operation was not designed to send a message alone. It demonstrated a capability that, if repeated, could systematically degrade Russian strategic air power over time. That reality triggered crisis management, not retaliation. Within hours, Vladimir Putin convened an emergency meeting with senior military leadership, including the chief of the general staff and commanders responsible for aerospace forces. These were not routine briefings. These are the meetings held when foundational assumptions collapse and threats stop working. What shattered in that moment was not just concrete or steel. It was confidence, the belief that certain assets were untouchable, the belief that red lines enforced themselves, the belief that deterrence could be maintained through rhetoric alone. And once deterrence fractures, every calculation changes. What followed the strikes was not what Moscow's doctrine promised. There was no immediate barrage, no dramatic escalation designed to reassert dominance. Instead, there was silence, a silence so abrupt and so complete that even the most hardline pro-Kremlin military voices struggled to explain it. This was not restraint born of confidence. It was paralysis born of exposure. When deterrence is credible, response is swift. When deterrence is questioned, leaders pause. Russian escalation doctrine relies on predictability, on the assumption that threats alone shape behavior. That assumption collapsed the moment Ukraine struck assets. Moscow had repeatedly declared off-limits and paid no immediate price for doing so. Intelligence assessments indicate that within hours of the confirmed strikes, the Kremlin convened an emergency consultation with top military leadership. These were not scheduled briefings. They were crisis meetings, the kind called when leaders realize their warnings have lost force and their options are narrowing by the minute. Retaliation carried risks Moscow could not control. A disproportionate response could trigger broader international consequences at a moment when Russia's conventional capabilities were already under strain. A nuclear signal would expose whether years of threats were ever meant to be acted upon. Doing nothing, while humiliating, preserved ambiguity. Silence bought time. That silence reverberated. Russian information channels went quiet. State media hesitated. Even nationalist commentators expressed frustration and disbelief. The absence of action became the story. And in deterrence theory, inaction after a challenge is itself a signal. Western officials watching closely understood the implication. The question was no longer whether Ukraine could strike deep into Russian territory. It was whether Moscow retained the ability to respond without accelerating its own strategic decline. The calculus had flipped. This is why the response from Washington carried unusual weight. The language emphasized sovereignty and irreversibility, not escalation management. It acknowledged reality rather than attempting to contain it. In diplomatic terms, That choice matters. It signals acceptance of a new phase rather than an effort to rewind the last one. For Moscow, silence was not a solution. It was a pause filled with recalculation, internal pressure, and the growing recognition that control over the tempo of this war had slipped away. When leaders fall silent after issuing threats, it is because they are confronting something they did not plan for. And once that realization sets in, every subsequent decision becomes more dangerous than the last. The shock waves from this operation did not stop at air bases or command rooms. They tore straight through the power structure that has held Russia together for nearly a quarter century. When deterrence fails externally, pressure explodes internally. And that is exactly what began unfolding inside Moscow. Russia's military establishment demanded escalation. After repeated humiliations on the battlefield, senior commanders pushed for authorization to deploy Russia's most destructive conventional capabilities. They argued that credibility could only be restored through force, that restraint now signaled weakness, and that anything less would invite further erosion of control. At the same time, the security services argued the opposite. They warned that escalation risked exposing institutional vulnerabilities that could not be repaired. Continued pressure threatened command cohesion, internal stability, and the very mechanisms that keep power centralized. For them, survival depended on limiting damage, not amplifying it. Then there were the oligarchs. Their concern was not pride or doctrine, it was loss. Sanctions had already stripped billions in assets. Seizures accelerated. Markets closed. The longer the conflict intensified, the more wealth evaporated. Their message was blunt. The bleeding had to stop. A negotiated pause, any pause, was preferable to continued attrition. Meanwhile, the propaganda apparatus faced its own crisis. It could not admit vulnerability. It could not explain silence. It could not reconcile years of absolute rhetoric with a moment of visible hesitation. Narrative control depends on certainty, and certainty had fractured. The story that Russia was untouchable no longer matched reality on the ground. At the center of these competing demands stood a leadership forced to balance escalation, restraint, and survival all at once. When power centers pull in opposite directions, decisions stop being strategic. They become reactive, and reactive decisions under pressure are where history turns dangerous. What made this moment uniquely unstable was timing. Domestic pressure converged with external exposure. Military credibility was questioned. Economic losses compounded. Information control wavered. Each faction demanded action, but each action carried consequences that could accelerate decline rather than reverse it. This is how systems strain. Not from a single blow, but from the accumulation of shocks that remove the margin for error. The silence from Moscow was not calm, it was compression. Pressure building without release. And when pressure reaches that point, the next move matters more than any before it. Washington's reaction was not routine, and it was not accidental. The language coming from the White House carried a weight that senior officials rarely allow into public view. This was not framed as provocation. It was framed as sovereignty. And in diplomatic terms, that distinction redraws the boundary of what comes next. For months, American policy operated inside a narrow corridor. Support Ukraine, but manage escalation. Arm Kyiv, but avoid actions that could trigger uncontrollable retaliation. That framework imposed implicit limits, especially on strikes inside Russian territory. What made this moment different was not an explicit announcement that those limits were gone, but something more telling: they were not reaffirmed. That omission spoke volumes. When officials described the strikes as precise, sovereign, and irreversible, they were signaling acceptance of a reality already unfolding. Irreversible is a loaded term. It means no rollback, no diplomatic rewind, no expectation that the clock can be reset to an earlier phase of the war. At the same time, Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation in a tone that startled Western analysts. There was no triumph, no bravado, only calm, deliberate framing. He spoke of justice unconstrained by geography, of threats losing meaning over time, and of ending aggression rather than escalating spectacle. That restraint mattered. It positioned the operation as strategic necessity, not emotional retaliation. Inside Washington, assessments shifted quickly. Officials acknowledged that Ukraine had demonstrated command and intelligence capabilities exceeding prior assumptions. Even more unsettling was the realization that this operation was conducted without real-time Western intelligence guidance. Kyiv planned, decided, and executed independently. That independence forces a recalculation. If Ukraine can strike assets of this significance on its own terms, then escalation management no longer belongs solely to Washington. The center of gravity has moved. The United States is now responding to a partner that has proven capable of shaping events rather than merely reacting to them. This marks a policy inflection point, not declared, not formalized, but unmistakable. Support is no longer just about enabling defense. It is about adjusting to a battlefield where Ukraine is setting tempo and Moscow is struggling to respond. And once tempo control shifts, the strategic balance follows. What comes next is no longer theoretical. Inside the Kremlin, three paths are being debated, each carrying risks that Moscow can no longer fully control. None of them restore the old balance. All of them expose weakness in different ways. The first option is escalation, a decisive, disproportionate response designed to reassert credibility and reimpose fear. This is the path favored by hardliners who believe restraint has already failed. But escalation now comes with a cost. Russia has struggled to absorb. Every major strike risks provoking broader consequences at a moment when conventional capacity is strained and deterrence has been publicly tested. Escalation may look strong, but it accelerates exposure. The second option is containment. Limited responses paired with intensified rhetoric, an attempt to rebuild deterrence through signaling rather than action. This preserves resources and avoids immediate blowback, but it carries a dangerous message. When red lines are crossed without consequence, repetition follows. Containment risks turning restraint into precedent. The third option is attrition through silence. Delay decisions. Absorb the shock. Recalculate quietly. This is the path of risk management, not victory. It buys time but concedes momentum. And momentum, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. Silence signals uncertainty to allies and adversaries alike. At the center of these debates stands Vladimir Putin, facing a reality he has spent years trying to avoid. Control over tempo has slipped. Assumptions about limits have collapsed. Each option narrows the next. What makes this moment dangerous is not the likelihood of one specific outcome, but the compression of choice. Decisions that once unfolded over months are now forced into days. Pressure is internal and external. The margin for error is thin, And as Moscow weighs these paths, one truth has already settled. The old rules no longer apply. The next move will define not just the next phase of this war, but the credibility of power itself. The next 48 to 72 hours carry disproportionate weight. This is the window where pressure, perception, and power collide. Intelligence agencies are not watching speeches. They are watching movement. Satellite coverage is continuous. Signal intelligence is saturated. Every shift in posture is being measured for intent. So far, the indicators are striking. There has been no elevation in Russia's nuclear alert level, no redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons, no change in submarine patrol patterns. Strategic facilities remain at normal security posture. These absences matter as much as any action. They suggest hesitation, not preparation. Inside Moscow, silence is doing the work that statements once did. It buys time, it allows recalculation, but it also exposes uncertainty. When a state that has relied on constant signaling suddenly goes quiet, analysts interpret it as internal debate, not confidence. For Ukraine, momentum is the message. Operations did not pause after the initial strikes. Sabotage, cyber activity, and reconnaissance continue at a steady tempo. The signal is clear. Geography no longer guarantees safety. Threats no longer dictate limits. The initiative has shifted, and Kyiv is not waiting for permission to act on it. Washington and NATO are watching with caution rather than alarm. Early warning systems remain fully engaged. Strategic command monitoring has intensified, not because escalation is expected, but because unpredictability has increased. A cornered actor does not always move immediately. Sometimes the danger comes later after silence hardens into decision. This is the phase where miscalculation carries the highest risk. A sudden overreaction could widen the conflict. Continued restraint could normalize Ukraine's new operational reach. Either outcome reshapes the battlefield and the diplomatic landscape simultaneously. What happens next will not be decided by words, but by whether Moscow acts, hesitates, or absorbs. Each choice locks in consequences that cannot be undone. What this moment represents is not a spike in violence, but a break in assumptions. For years, escalation management defined this war. Boundaries were implied, enforced as much by caution as by capability. Ukraine was expected to defend, to absorb, to respond within limits others believed they controlled. That framework has now fractured. By striking assets once treated as untouchable and facing silence rather than immediate retaliation, Ukraine exposed the gap between threat and action. Deterrence that depends on rhetoric alone does not survive contact with reality. Once crossed without consequence, red lines stop functioning as restraints and start revealing weakness. This is why the implications extend beyond a single operation.